Good evening, dear students. Welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 28th July 2025, and today we have some very important topics for the discussion. So, one by one, we'll try to look into all these topics in a very detailed and in-depth manner. So, the first topic with which we're going to start this discussion is about the glacial lake outburst floods. And this article has been given in the Hindu newspaper, and this is very important for General Studies paper 1. So in General Studies paper 1 we have geography syllabus. So therefore in geography this is very important. Now apart from that, in General Studies paper 3 also we have a disaster management. So in disaster management also, the glacial lake outburst floods are very important, because in recent times, because of the climate change, melting of glaciers, the glacial lake outburst floods have become very common. And because of that reason, for General Studies paper 3 disaster management section and General Studies paper 1 for geography also, this is a very important topic. So let's try to understand what exactly is a glacial lake outburst floods, how they are usually taking place, and what is the vulnerability of India for these glacial lake outburst floods, and what are the major causes, and how India can take steps to understand the context is that India has been intensifying efforts to counter the glacial lake such. Right? So climate change has been leading to melting of glaciers, and Himalayas are also tectonically very active as well. So therefore all these factors have been leading to the glacial lake outburst floods. However, the National Disaster Management Authority has launched a national program to identify, monitor, and mitigate the risks from at risk of these glacial lakes, so that the vulnerability can be substantially reduced. And apart from that, the glacial lake outburst floods can be minimized to a substantial scale. So let's understand what exactly is a glacial lake outburst flood. Now, this glacial lake outburst flood is actually a sudden or a quick release of water from the glacial lake. Now, in Himalayas, the glacial lakes are very common, because Himalayas are lying at a high altitude regions, and in those high altitude regions, the glacial lakes are very common. Now, the glacial lake outburst flood is actually a sudden release of water from the glacial lake due to dam failure, and it often leads to a catastrophic downstream flooding. Right? So this is what is called as the glacial lake outburst flood that we have already seen in states like Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh as well. Now, what is the glacial lake outburst or the glacial lake? So let's understand the glacial lake. Right? So as I've already told you that these glacial lakes are very common at a higher altitudes, and in fact they are formed when the glacial ice or the moraines or the natural depressions, so they are impounded with water. And in fact the moraines are created, they create a topographic depression in which the meltwater accumulates over a period of time. You can see on this image. So these are the glacial lakes, right? So in fact, sudden release of water from these glacial lakes would result in the glacial lake outburst floods. Right, so let's understand the threat from the glacial lake outburst floods across Himalayas. Now, understand that Himalayas, particularly the high elevation or high altitude Himalayas, there are very common glacial lakes. And sometimes, due to dam failure, the water would be suddenly released from these glacial lakes, and that would cause a catastrophic downstream flooding, and that is disastrous or destructive. So, Nepal recently faced multiple glacial lake outburst flood events in places like Mustang, Humla, and Solukhumbu districts. Now, in all these three districts, Nepal had seen the glacial lake outburst floods. So, you just have to remember this because when you are writing an answer, you just have to mention examples of such events so that the answer would be much more effective and impactful. And in July 2024, the glacial lake outburst destroyed a China built bridge. Now, this is another event of the glacial lake outburst flood apart from Nepal. And this event in China disrupted the power supply, and therefore it has highlighted a lack of a transboundary early warning systems. Right? So, what are these transboundary early warning systems? Now, imagine that India and Nepal share the borders with each other. Now imagine that the Nepal is in upstream and India is in downstream. India is in downstream. So therefore, in case suddenly there is a glacial lake outburst flood in Nepal, now the water suddenly moves from the upstream to downstream. So here downstream is India. So if we have put in place the transboundary early warning systems, the transboundary early warning systems, then we can alert in case a glacial lake outburst flood in Nepal. So we can quickly alert India about this glacial lake outburst flood. And that is the importance of the transboundary early warning system that has to be put in place. However, so historically there were some glacial lake outburst floods that have already taken place. And when you are writing an answer about the glacial lake outburst flood event, so make sure to mention these examples, right? So historically, the Digi show 1985 glacial lake outburst, Tama Pukhari 1998 glacial lake outburst flood. So they actually show that there is a recurring nature of this Gulf threat. What is a recurring nature? Now first understand, imagine in Nepal at a place called Humla, there is a glacial lake outburst flood, right? So there is no guarantee that such an event will not take place very immediately, right? So therefore, it actually means that once a glacial lake outburst flood took place in Humla, next month or after 2 months or after 6 months, again there might be a chance of the glacial lake outburst flood taking place in this same place. So therefore, the glacial lake outburst floods are recurring in nature. So therefore, they are more disastrous. And however, the supraglacial or moraine dammed lakes are the two major types of the glacial lakes in the Indian Himalayan region. Right? So you have to understand both supraglacial as well as the moraine dammed lakes are the two major types of glacial lakes. Now, in India, the Indian Himalayan region, so it actually houses around 28,000 glacial lakes. So, out of 28,000 glacial lakes in Indian Himalayan region, with 7,500 in India alone, right? So, many of these glacial lakes are above 4,500 meters of altitude. So, therefore, it will be very difficult, it will be very challenging to monitor them regularly, to assess their vulnerability. So, therefore, it has been creating a lot of challenges to regularly monitor such glacial lakes. Now, what is India's mitigation strategy for this glacial lake outburst floods? Now, at the national level, we have a National Disaster Management Authority. So that actually prepares a set of guidelines to reduce or mitigate the vulnerability or the impact of the glacial lake outburst floods. So the National Disaster Management Authority so now shifted focus to risk reduction and early warning systems. Right, so this is very important, right? So through the disaster risk reduction, it has shifted focus to risk reduction. It has to focus on risk reduction, along with that the early warning systems, right? So this actually ensures adequate time for the disaster preparedness. So through disaster preparedness, what we can do, we can reduce the vulnerability of such a disaster in case of the glacial lake outburst flood events, right? So disaster preparedness also includes evacuation of people, minimizing the loss of life, the loss to the property. So all these factors forms part of the disaster preparedness. Setting up relief camps, food, medicine would be provided for the people who were evacuated, right? So all these things forms part of the disaster preparedness, right? So therefore, the National Disaster Management Authority, as part of the mitigation strategy for these glacial lake outburst floods, a $20 million program has also already been launched. And in fact, this program covers around 195 glacial lakes in the Indian Himalayan region, right? So around 195 glacial lakes. So it is very important to identify the risk level. So how risky a glacial lake, and what is the chance that this glacial lake will turn into a glacial lake outburst flood. So thereby, ultimately through this analysis and assessment, we will be preventing the potential glacial lake outburst floods. And in fact, the National Disaster Management Authority has adopted a five-pronged approach to reduce the vulnerability and the mitigation of glacial lake outbursts. So, firstly, assessment. So, assessment should be done for the glacial lakes, right? So, how risky these glacial lakes are. So, therefore, the glacial hazard assessment is mandatory, and that is the first thing. And apart from that, the early warning system should be put in place, right? So early warning system should also be put in place, and retention structure should be built. Community engagement, community awareness has to be created for a comprehensive disaster risk reduction with respect to the glacial lake outburst floods. So these measures have to be taken. And in fact, states have also deployed expeditions using bathymetry techniques, ERT, unmanned aerial vehicle surveys, and synthetic aperture radar interferometry to study the terrain changes and assesses the risks of the glacial lake outburst floods. So therefore, it actually follows a multi-pronged strategy which particularly aimed at reducing vulnerability of the glacial lake outburst floods. And in fact, the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, it supports the manual alerts with respect to the glacial lakes in case if the early warning system is not put in place readily. Then Indo-Tibetan Border Police supports with the manual alerts, and that helps in adequate disaster preparedness and also reducing the vulnerability through to such disasters. And in fact, permanent stations are also now installed at some glacial lakes for flood early warning as well. And apart from that, more such expeditions are also planned post monsoon to address critical data and the technology gaps which are existing. Now, understand, if we have adequate data about the glacial lakes, so we can understand and assess the vulnerability and the risk that is posed by these glacial lake outburst floods and technology gaps also, right? So therefore, we need to have adequate data. We should have appropriate technology that will help address the vulnerability to the glacial lake outburst floods, right? So this is the mitigation strategy that is followed by the National Disaster Management Authority. So let's understand the glacial lake outburst floods and the risk factors, right? So the glacial lake outburst floods, so they occur when dammed water bodies, they suddenly release water due to ice, landslides, melting, or earthquakes, right? So in case of landslides, a melting or earthquakes, so they just suddenly release a lot of water downstream, and that causes the glacial lake outburst floods, which are destructive and they are also catastrophic. And the glacial lake outburst floods leads to the loss of lives as well as immense loss to the property as well, right? So it is very important to define glacial lake outburst floods. Now, in fact, the Indian Himalayan region has 11 river basins. These 11 river basins are prone to the glacial lake outburst floods. So, therefore, the glacial hazard assessment is also very, very important in these 11 river basins. And apart from that, the other factors which are causing the glacial lake outburst floods, including the rising global temperatures due to the climate change. So we all knew that after industrial revolution and because of deforestation and increased use of fossil fuels, so all these factors have substantially increased the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that has led to the climate change, and climate change has been causing the glacial melting. And apart from that, inaccessible terrains in these higher elevations are also making it more and more challenging to monitor the glacial the glacial lakes. And apart from that, the lack of real-time weather stations and lack of the early warning systems, all these factors have been increasing the vulnerability to the glacial lake outburst floods. So, past disasters like Kedarnath 2013 and South Lonak 2023. So, the floods in these past situations, so they highlight and underscore the high impact risks of these mountain hazards and the need for an effective glacial lake outburst flood management strategies that have to be followed, particularly in the Indian Himalayan region, so that we can actually mitigate and also reduce the vulnerability from the glacial lake outburst floods. So, therefore, the increasing frequency of this glacial lake outburst floods actually highlight the urgent need for climate change adaptation and improve the risk reduction strategies in the Himalayan region, right? So therefore, one thing that we should understand, climate change is a new reality, right? So climate change is a new reality, and what the focus should be on is adaptation and mitigation. And along with adaptation and mitigation, we need to follow the risk reduction strategies, right? So in fact, the global temperatures are also continues to increase, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, particularly the Paris, conference of parties. So Paris Agreement aimed at, agreement aimed at limiting the global temperatures below 2 degree Celsius, pre-industrial level, right? So, however, the IPCC data clearly telling us that the global temperatures will rise past 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2050 itself, because the global temperatures have been continues to increase. Now, if global temperatures continues to increase, there will be melting of glaciers and there will be increased threat of glacial lake outburst floods and other climate related disasters also in Indian Himalayan region and other parts of Indian subcontinent. Now, we all knew that the Indian subcontinent is a heavily populated region. a heavily populated region. So in case of such disasters, there will be heavy casualties, right? So there will be loss of property as well. So therefore, we need to follow the disaster risk mitigation methods, right? And for example, the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction should be followed, and Hugo framework on disaster risk reduction methods should be followed or should be integrated in the mitigation strategies of glacial lake outburst floods, right? So along with that, we should also focus on the early warning systems. So because early warning systems will give us ample amount of time for the disaster preparedness, ample amount of time for the disaster preparedness. So all these factors should be kept in mind when we are planning the mitigation strategies for the glacial lake outburst floods. So I hope you have understood this topic. And next very important topic is about the age of consent under the Protection of Children from the Sexual Offences Act of 2012. Now, understand one thing, that the age of consent is very often in news about the POCSO Act, right? So particularly the age of 16 to 18 years, because it is said that you know the relationship between children who are 16 to 18 years of age, whether it should be considered under the POCSO Act, because POCSO Act talks about stringent punishments, but there are consensual sexual relationships among children who are 16 to 18 years of age. But the key question is, should we consider 16 to 18 years old children as children, or they should be considered as adolescents? So that is the key question here. Right, so let's understand the context, because this is very important for your gender studies paper 2. From gender studies paper 2 point of view, and even gender studies paper 1 point of view, particularly Indian society. So this is very important. This has been given in the this has been given in the Hindu newspaper. Right. So let's understand the age of consent under the POCSO Act. Now, recently, the senior advocate Indra Jaising, who appointed the amicus curiae, so it submitted to the Supreme Court that the consensual sexual relationships between adolescents who are aged 16 to 18 years should not be criminalized under the POCSO Act of 2012. Now, understand that there are a lot of legislations in India which considers adolescents, every individual who is less than 18 years of age is a child, right? So every individual who is less than 18 years of age is considered as child in India. But the senior advocate Indira Jaising recently submitted a report to the Supreme Court, and this report told that the consensual sexual relationships between the adolescents in the age group of 16 to 18 years of age should not be criminalized under the POCSO Act, POCSO Act of 2012. Now, as of now, if two adolescents who are aged 17 and 18 and they have this consensual sexual relationship, so then also the provisions of POCSO will be applicable for them, and you know then they will be considered as a victim and the accused under the POCSO Act. So this is what it has said. Now, why this recommendation has been given? So this recommendation has been given to prevent the misuse of the POCSO Act, because in recent times there has been an increased misuse of the POCSO Act. And because of that reason, in order to prevent the misuse of the POCSO Act, so this suggestion has been given. So let's understand what exactly is a POCSO Act. Now, this POCSO Act is the protection of children from sexual offences. So that was an act enacted in the year 2012. And POCSO Act has been enacted to protect children who are less than 18 years of age, right? So those whoever is uh, 18 years of age, so they will be protected under the POCSO Act. And in fact, it has admitted that the number of sexual offences against the children were neither specifically provided for in existing laws nor adequately penalized. And therefore, an offence against children needs to be explicitly defined and countered through the proportionate penalties so that it acts as an effective deterrence. Right? So therefore, there's a convention at the global level. The convention is UN Convention on the Rights of Children. So that is the convention. And India has ratified the convention in the year 1992. And this convention actually requires the sexual exploitation and sexual abuse to be addressed as a heinous crimes in the national jurisdictions. So, since India ratified this global convention, India has framed and passed the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act of 2012. And any sexual offence against any children who is 18 years uh, below the age, then it will be considered as a heinous crime and there will be stringent punishments as well under the POCSO Act. Right? So, in fact, the POCSO Act 2012, so it has provided for the definition of a child, and it clearly mentioned that anyone who is below 18 years of age, right? So anyone who is below 18 years of age is considered as child. So therefore, any sexual act with a person who is under 18 years is considered as non-consensual and criminal, regardless of the mutual agreement between the adolescents, right? So even if they have the mutual agreement or they have the consensual sexual relationship, then also it will be considered as a crime under the POCSO Act. Right? So it has clearly defined who is a child. So anybody who is less than 18 years of age is a child. So therefore, any sexual relationship, any sexual act with a person under 18 years is considered as a non-consensual and it is a criminal act. However, if we can carefully look into the judicial observations or the rights-based critics of this POCSO Act of 2012, so they have highlighted the criminalizing tendency of the consensual relationship. So as I have already given you the example, imagine that two adolescents who are 17 and 18 years of age or 16 or 17 years of age, if they have a consensual sexual relationship, then also under the POCSO Act, such a relationship will be criminalized. So therefore, the rights-based critics have been highlighting the criminalizing consensual relationships among the adolescents who are aged 16 to 18 years of age. And this leads to unjust prosecutions and social stigma despite absence of the exploitative intent. So they don't have the exploitative intent when they come into this, a consensual sexual relationship, right? So, however, despite there is no exploitative intent, but there are always unjust prosecutions and social stigma which is attached to such an adolescence. To some extent, it is also part of protecting children as well, right? And there is a specific section, Section 6 of the POCSO Act. Section 6 of the POCSO Act. And this Section 6 of the POCSO Act has aligned the provisions of the IPC, Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, and the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act of 2006 with penetrative sexual assault on any minor that attracts severe penalties or that would result in stringent punishments. Stringent punishments and severe penalties with no current legal scope for exceptions in the consensual adolescent cases, right? So if we talk about the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act of 2012, so what is its aim? Its aim is the gender neutral legislation. Now, what is a gender neutral legislation? The provisions of a law will be applicable for both genders. So there will be no gender discrimination. The provisions of a law will be applicable for both genders equally. So therefore, it ensures child safety. It punishes the offenders based on the severity of offences, and it comprehensively addresses the child sexual offence or abuses, thereby protecting children. Right? So, as we have already understood the definition of a child, because the POCSO Act of 2012 clearly provides for the definition of a child. So any individual who is below 18 years of age will be considered as a child. And apart from that, there are three broad categories of sexual offences which are punishable under the POCSO Act. One is sexual assault, sexual harassment, using child for a pornography. Right? So all these factors would be considered as three broad categories of sexual offences. And 2019 amendment, so it has introduced more stringent punishments, including the death penalty for committing a sexual crime on children as well. So the incidents which have been taking place in the present society have compelled the legislators to come up with such stringent punishments and penalties in case of any such offences against children. Now let's understand the judicial and legal interventions on the age under the POCSO Act. Now a petition has been filed by Advocate Nipun Saxena and submissions by Indira Jaising. They actually call for an exception for the consensual sexual activity between 16 to 18 years of age. Now in case of a consensual sexual activity between the ages of 16 and 18, so there should be an exception for them under the POCSO Act, right? So in fact, in Vijay Lakshmi versus State Representatives in 2021, the Madras High Court has proposed a safeguard by recommending that the age gap between the partners be more be no more than 5 years to prevent predatory relationships disguised as the consensual relationship. Right? So the age gap should not be more than 5 years, and it is what the Madras High Court has been held in Vijayalakshmi versus State Representatives case 2021. However, the Law Commission has opposed changing the age of consent but endorsed the guided judicial discretion during sentencing to differentiate between exploitative conduct and non-exploitative adolescent intimacy. But it is very difficult to determine what is an exploitative conduct, exploitative sexual offense, or non-exploitative adolescent intimacy, right? However, the Law Commission has clearly opposed this, changing the age of consent, right? So age of consent in the sense that 16 to 18 years should be given an exception under the POCSO Act, but Law Commission has clearly opposed this. But Law Commission has endorsed a guided judicial discretion while sentencing to differentiate. So Law Commission has clearly mentioned that judiciary should determine, should differentiate what is an exploitative conduct and what is a non-exploitative adolescent intimacy. Right? So if you look at the crime and punishment under the POCSO Act, the aggravated sexual assault on a child who is under 12 years of age, then 20 years in jail or lifetime or even death penalty based on the severity of the crime, and a minimum jail term of for an aggravated assault enhanced from 7 years to 10 years of minimum jail term, and for an aggravated sexual assault on a child who is below 16 years, then 20 years in jail. So use of children for porn, possession of child porn, then 5 to 3 years in jail, and storing child porn for 1,000 rupees of fine, right? So this is the crime and punishment under the POCSO Act. Now, what should be the way forward in this context? So let's understand the way forward as well. So if we talk about the way forward, there is an exception clause for the consensual acts between adolescents who are aged between 16 to 18, so would protect individual rights and at the same time upholding the protective objectives of POCSO Act, thereby ensuring that genuine cases of abuse are not diluted. And similarly, there is a need for a comprehensive adolescent sex education as well that should take place from the school level. And similarly, there is a need for the legal awareness, right? So these things must be implemented to inform youth about the implications of law, particularly with respect to the POCSO Act and the concept of consent as well. Otherwise, they would face stringent punishments under the POCSO Act, which completely destroys their life. So, therefore, the comprehensive adolescent sex education is also very, very important. Similarly, blanket criminalization, right? So, the blanket criminalization right up to 18 years of age would undermine the judicial efficiency and it would also harm the young individuals who are emotionally and socially. So hence, the judicial discretion must be codified with safeguards to prevent the arbitrary outcomes under the POCSO Act, right? So therefore, these factors have to be kept in mind. And this should be way forward. And there is a need for an extensive debate about the age within the POCSO Act so that we can actually differentiate the exploitative and non-exploitative adolescent consensual sexual relationships, right? So I hope you have understood this topic. And the next important topic is China has been building a mega dam on the Brahmaputra River, right? So let's understand this in a very detailed manner and why China has been building a mega dam on the Brahmaputra River and what will be the implications on India and the other neighboring countries and how it is going to affect uh, you know the water flows on the Brahmaputra River. Now this is given in the Indian Express newspaper and this would be important for the gender studies paper 2 and for gender studies paper 3 also this could be important and along with that your prelims examination also this is important. So let's try to understand the context of this topic. The context is that China has been building a large hydroelectric project on Yarlung River. Now in Tibet, this river is called as Yarlung Tsangpo River. And in India, the very same river is called as Brahmaputra River near Arunachal Pradesh. And the other thing that we should understand here is that China has been building such a large hydropower project very close to Arunachal Pradesh. And in fact, its capacity is 60,000 megawatt. Right, so this is a huge capacity, 60,000 megawatts of electricity production through the hydropower project and in fact, this is also $167.8 billion mega dam. However, such a mega dam on Yarlung Sangbo River, very close to Arunachal Pradesh, has triggered concerns in India over the water flows, ecological impact, and the strategic risks that India would face through building such a massive dam. Now, what are the strategic and environmental concerns for India as China building such a massive dam worth of 167.8 billion US dollars. And the dam is located at the Great Bend in Medong County, very close to Arunachal Pradesh. And in fact, the Yarlung Zangbo becomes Siang or the Brahmaputra River. So once it crosses this dam, so the Yarlung Zangbo is called as Siang River or the Brahmaputra River. Now, experts like Ashok Kanta who is a strategic affairs analyst. So they actually warn that the project is constructed in a seismically active zone. We all knew that the Himalayas are they are tectonically, seismically very active zones because at the edge of Himalayas, the Indian plate is colliding with the Eurasian plate. So therefore, they are seismically very active, and this is also ecologically a very fragile area. So thereby, it is very risky building such a massive dam very close to Arunachal Pradesh. So uh, you know, it could have a disastrous impact on India as well, such as floods and all those such things. However, India has been fears that China may weaponize the dam during the conflict to pressure India, or it could alter the water flows as well from the Yarlung Zangpo River into the Indian side. So China may also suddenly release a large amounts of water through such a dam, or if China goes for a reservoir mismanagement, so that can actually cause a huge flooding downstream. Or if China blocks water supply from this Yarlung Zangpo river, then it would cause droughts in downstream. If China releases water, a large scale water on a sudden, then it would lead to flooding, especially in states like Assam and Arunachal Pradesh. And in fact, the Arunachal Pradesh Chief Minister, Pema Khandu, termed the project as an existential threat for the state of Arunachal Pradesh, and it could be a potentially water bomb on Arunachal Pradesh in particular and India in general. Right? So, what is India's response to this mega dam built by China? Now, India continues to express concerns about the downstream impact to China through diplomatic channels. So India has been widely using the diplomatic channels to convey all its concerns to China about building such a large-scale mega dam very close to Arunachal Pradesh. Secondly, the officials have also been emphasizing on the need for transparent hydrological data sharing to assess the flow variations and the flood risks as well. Right? So thirdly, India has been planning for a buffer storage, like Upper Siang project has been planned by India in the state of Arunachal Pradesh, but it has been facing a local opposition due to the environmental concerns that such an Upper Siang project would, uh, you know, uh, would result in. However, the foreign secretary level agreements have focused on confidence building measures amid the broader tensions between India and China. However, the experts have been calling for coordinated protocols with countries like Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar for a disaster preparedness in case of floods or drought like conditions. And apart from floods, droughts, it could also have ecological impact on the Brahmaputra river as well. However, the project's overall potential, the project will have adverse environmental impact on the lower riparian states, and that has led to a calls for international water treaty to address these concerns. Right, so there will be a lot of international concerns. Right, so therefore there is a need for a multilateral, a multinational, international water treaty that could actually address all these concerns. Now, what is the significance of the Brahmaputra River? So let's understand the significance of the Brahmaputra River as well. So we all knew that Brahmaputra River passes through the northeastern states, Arunachal Pradesh, Assam into Bangladesh. So Brahmaputra River is called as the lifeline of the state of Assam. It is very important for agriculture, ecology, and economy for the state of Assam. And in fact, the this Brahmaputra River, so it originates as Yarlung Zangpo in Tibet. It enters Siang and it becomes a Brahmaputra in Assam. However, despite the dam, 70% of the Brahmaputra's flows comes from rainfall and tributaries in India and Bhutan. So therefore, experts also suggest that we need not to worry because 70% of the water from the Brahmaputra in the Brahmaputra river comes from the rainfall and the tributaries in India and Bhutan. However, building such a massive dam would have the strategic as well as other concerns on the Indian side. It also impacts the fragile ecosystem of the river. However, India is known as the lower riparian state with respect to the Brahmaputra river, with established user rights under the international law. But here the concern is that China's disregard for the international law, and that will be a concern for India. However, the National Water Development Authority has proposed the inland channel links to distribute surplus water much more effectively. However, the construction of this mega dam on the Yarlung-Zangpo River could become the biggest dam in the world, right? So no doubt that this dam on Yarlung-Zangpo River on Chinese side is considered as the biggest dam in the world, and it has raised several concerns not only in India but also among other low riparian neighboring countries. So therefore, there is a need for an international water treaty which actually governs the river waters from Yarlung Sangpo into India and into Bangladesh. Right? So the project's formidable hydro potential, while impressive, but it comes with significant risks due to the location in a seismically active zone. Right? So therefore, it is the responsibility of China to address all these concerns of the lower riparian states before going ahead with constructing such a large-scale dam on Yarlung Sangpo River in Tibet. So next important topic is, so India has recently launched first hydrogen powered trains, and it is going to become a reality, right? So this could be important for prelims examination and for mains examination for general studies paper 3. This could be important. So what is the context? So the context is that Indian Railways recently successfully tested first hydrogen powered coach, and that is manufactured at Integral Coach Factory at Chennai. And in fact, building first hydrogen powered coach is considered as a major step towards launching a hydrogen powered train, enhancing clean mobility and reducing the overall greenhouse gas emissions from the railways. Right? So, what is the project overview and the technological aspects of it? So, the Northern Railway Zone is executing 136 crore project that was initiated in 2021. However, this project actually involves converting 10 coach demo train with two 1600 HP cars into a hydrogen powered multiple unit. And here each power car carries 220 kg of hydrogen, which is stored in cylinders at 350 bar pressure. And the Integral Coach Factory in Chennai is spearheading the coach design and the trials of the hydrogen made coaches. And here, hydrogen will be used via fuel cell powered traction systems, replacing the traditional design or replacing the traditional diesel engines. Right? So, India's first hydrogen train, so it will result in zero emissions from Indian railways. So, if we take this forward, right, because it just releases water vapor only, and it supports net zero carbon or target of India. And so apart from that, you know it is having a lot of advantages. It can maintain optimum levels of speed, and it is powered by the hydrogen fuel cells, and it will have 8 passenger coaches, and it will have hydrogen storage coaches, right? So therefore it is having all advantages compared to the conventional trains. So therefore it is a very good initiative on the part of Indian Railways to transform Indian Railways into green transportation system, because that would significantly reduces the emissions. So even though as of now Indian Railways have made a significant improvement in terms of electrification, but most of this electricity comes from the thermal power plants, which are also using coal for generating electricity. So therefore, that will not be considered as a sustainable thing. So therefore, that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much.